Ready?
Hit it!
Hello everyone and welcome to Variety Theatre, the Spice of Life podcast with Maria Lovelady
and Michael Alan-Bailey, a podcast that aims to bring all things variety out of the wings and into the limelight.
So without further ado, let's get this show on the road.
Coming up on today's episode,
we talk to the gag writer to the stars, Brad Ashton,
find out which northern comedian could speak Chinese,
and find out which popular music hall entertainer used to parade Soho with a monkey on his shoulder.
Hello, Michael.
Hello, Maria.
So what have we been up to this week?
What haven't we been up to? Well, we are freshly back, aren't we, from an event today.
We are. Just this morning, we were at the unveiling of the Fred Barnes Plaque in Warwick Avenue with the British Music Hall Society.
And we really didn't know what to expect. We've just become members of the British Music Hall Society. And so this was our first time interacting with everybody and meeting everybody. And we've been in contact with everyone from people helping us out when we were doing Twice Nightly and all things like that. But this was the first time we were coming face to face with a lot of these people.
And it was fabulous.
It was absolutely incredible. We loved it, didn't we?
What we expected. So we got to hang out with the president of the British Music Hall Society, none other than the one and only Mr. Paul O'Grady.
We had a lovely chat with him. He was so nice, wasn't he?
He was everything that we ever wanted him to be, and he was so generous and kind and gave us a lot of his time, so thank you.
And we just ended up talking about what was on the telly.
We did. What else do you want to talk about? These are the important things in life. And and we got to just speak to so many wonderful people. There was a great performance at the unveiling of the plaque by Christopher Green, singing.
Who was incredible. Mm-hmm. They did a medley of Fred Barnes' hits, and it was stunning.
It was stunning. Very well performed, but incredibly moving as well.
And so relevant in modern times. Like it was one of those things that it could have easily not made sense out of context, and in a modern setting, but it just didn't. It was so relevant today that you can't believe that it was written like around 100 years ago. 100%. And we found out so much more about Fred Barnes than we knew going in, isn't it? We sort of went in knowing the basics about him, but we learnt so much more about this really complex man.
We did. So that brings us on to our first fact of the day.
Go for it. Let's have our fact. What is it?
So my fact really is just to give our listeners a little bit more information about Fred Barnes. So Fred Barnes was a lad from Birmingham, and he was living as an openly gay music hall performer. Mm-hmm. And obviously in that era, that was a really brave and bold thing to do.
A big taboo.
Yeah, a really big taboo. And he got his most famous hit, for those that you don't know, was called The Black Sheep of the Family. And that was the song actually today that really moved us, that Christopher Green song, because he was talking about how he was the black sheep of the family because he was gay. And actually, his father committed suicide when he became famous. And it's generally thought that one of the reasons was because his dad was quite ashamed and couldn't handle that his son was so openly gay. He's a very flamboyant character. He would walk around Soho with a monkey on his shoulder, and later in life, when he couldn't afford the monkey, he had a chicken instead. So he was
instead of just not having anything, it's like, do you know what? I can't afford a monkey, so I'll just have nothing on my shoulder. It's like, no,
I've got to have something.
I've got to have something on my shoulder.
My cold shoulder.
I'll have a chicken on my shoulder. That'll be excellent. Hey!
So Fred Barnes released this hit when he was 23 years old, and he became like an overnight sensation. And as we just hear time and time again, it was just very hard for him to cope with the fame. He began drinking. He began spending way too lavishly. When his father died, he inherited so much money that he actually became an overnight millionaire. And by the end of his life, he was broke. He was an alcoholic. He was singing in pubs for
the price of a drink.
For the price of a drink. And we just hear this story time and time again, don't we? Where these people have these huge successes and they can't handle it. And we spoke to Christopher Green today, who performed at the event. And they said that Fred Barnes actually had a lot of self-loathing, and he was very deeply troubled man. And it's just quite sad, really, isn't it? Because obviously we've come a long way in some respects for queer performers. But on another hand, the fact that we're still talking about this, and Christopher did an amazing speech at the unveiling of the plaque that was really moving about how we still have a lot of work to do in that space. And I just think it's really important that we remember stars like Fred, who were pioneering this stuff. We celebrate him for who he was and everything that he achieved in his lifetime. Because
you think as hard as it is for everybody now in this day and age to still be trying to kick doors down and make progress and get things done, he was doing it back then when there was no vocabulary for that kind of thing. There was no understanding. You know, he couldn't just like hop onto social media and find like-minded people like himself. It must have been so isolating and so lonely.
But one of the things that we love about this world and this genre is that the one place that you could really be a little bit more like yourself than normal is the world of music hall, variety and theatre.
And that's where you could reach people, and that's where you could put your feelings out there, I guess.
And I think the fact that the song itself became such a sensation shows that people resonated with it.
Exactly.
Because, you know, he was saying that he was the black sheep of the family. The lyrics say that he wanted to come back and be the white sheep. And I think that song is for anyone that's ever felt a bit on the outside. And the fact that it was such a sensation means that loads of people did resonate with it when it came out.
I think our recommendation to anyone is go and Google the lyrics to that song, because it's beautiful, isn't it? Yeah. It's stunning. And I think that anybody can relate to it somehow. There's something to relate to on a universal scale, isn't there?
Absolutely.
From anyone who's ever felt like that. Do you know what the thing, I guess, as well, is that it's almost like a shock every single time, but it's a consistent thing, is that it's almost a surprise to us when the conclusion that you come to hearing about all these performers, the Dan Lenos, the Maria Lloyds, the Fred Barnes, is that at the end of the day, as much as we think of them now as legends and myths, they were humans. You know?
Yeah.
And it's the conclusion we keep coming to. And each time we're like, well, and then it turned out that they were just like the rest of us. You know what I mean? But that's so lovely, isn't it? To think that.
And the same of so many stars, I think, and even stars today. And it does make you think, why do people do it? Why do people go after this dream? Because a lot of the time it doesn't end like a fairy tale. And
that's not necessarily something that's hidden. I think that's quite open and quite out there, is that it's not great. It's not a great life.
Yeah, but it's just the life that, especially someone like Fred, was a world where he could be himself.
Well, this is the thing is, it's not a great life, but it can be. That's the thing, isn't it? It's kind of what
the highs are worth the lows.
Exactly.
Yeah. So how about you? What's your fact of the day?
Well, my fact of the day comes from a chat that we had today, actually, at the Fred Barnes Plaque, which is, I didn't know that the word hippodrome, so obviously a lot of theatres are named, you know, we've got like the Bristol Hippodrome and theatres like that. The word hippodrome actually comes from an ancient Greek word meaning like a horse race. You know, like an arena that a horse race would take place in. It comes from that. Chariot racing and horse racing would take place in a hippodrome.
Wow, so it's that epic place that you could watch something so, epic and dramatic happening.
Exactly. And apparently it also comes from the fact that a lot of these theatres were built originally, they were built to accommodate circuses.
So with all, you know, back in those days, with all the animals and all of that was going on.
Exactly. And if you look at theatres that have hippodrome in the title, usually it's set out more like an arena than a theatre.
Right. And then we also were talking, weren't we, about how they a lot of the stages had to be reinforced for animals like elephants.
Yeah, exactly. Because they were built to be really strong to support. So to support the artists.
Well, today we have got such an interesting guest for you all to listen to. The one and only Brad Ashton. So, Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about Brad's career before you get to hear this fantastic interview with him?
So, Brad was a writer. He was a script writer and primarily a gag writer. Now, Brad has written for, I think, any big name in British comedy.
And he's written books about being a comedy writer. He's led courses on how to be a comedy writer, and we spoke to him and had a fabulous time. And I don't think there's much more to say because I think that Brad says it all in the interview.
It speaks for itself. Should we hear it? Let's get it on. Really nice to meet you, Brad. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Well, anything for a laugh. Okay.
That's our motto.
I've never done a podcast before. In fact, I didn't even know what the heck it is, but still, we'll play through with it.
Let's start right at the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about how the variety of theatre has spiced up your life?
Well, it started. I was a tailor for 7 years. I left school at 14, and I wanted to go into show business. I used to read magazines. I played truant for the school all the time and read magazines and books about show business. I was fascinated. But my father, being Jewish, was very careful. He said, "You want it, Bernard, as my name was then." He said, "If you want to go into show business, have a trade behind you first." He said, because so many people are going broke. So I had to be a tailor for 7 years. And I hated it so much that I was willing to go into show business and put up with all the problems you get in show business. So that's how it started. Getting into show business wasn't the easiest thing. I used to read a magazine called Weekly Show Business and Sporting Review, and it had half of it was about sports, and the other half was about show business. And I decided it would be a good shop window for me. So I went on to the editor, Isidore Green. I said, "I'd like to write a column for you." He said, "We can't afford it." I said, "I'll do it for nothing." He said, "When can you start?" So I was writing about 1,000 words a week, but I was covering the Hackney Empire and the Finsbury Park Empire. I lived in Clapton, which is about halfway between the two of them. And I used to go along there, and that was the basis of my column, covering the shows that were there. But I threw in as many gags as I could think of, because that was my shop window. And at that time, almost every comedian in the business used to subscribe to the cutting service. They paid 8 guineas a week, and any time their name appeared in any paper anywhere in the country, they would get a copy of it. When I realised this, and I put in as many gags as I could, mentioned as many names as I could, and that meant that all the comedians who had that subscription service at least knew my name. And as a result of that column, after I think about 3 or 4 months, the BBC producer, Johnny Stewart, spotted it. They were looking for a writer for the show band show at that time, which was being written at that time by Dick Vosburgh and Dick Bentley. And Dick Bentley had backed out, and they were looking for a writer, and that's what got me started.
Did you ever have any aspirations to actually be a performer yourself, Brad?
Well, yes, I was in the Air Force doing my national service. And I used to listen to all the radio programs, the Braden program, all the programs at the time, fascinated by it. And I wanted to be a comedian. And I wrote myself an act. In those days, there was the Nuffield Centre. Nuffield Centre was the English version of the Sage Door Canteen. It was for soldiers, sailors, and airmen, a club for them. And every Tuesday, there was a show there. And Tony Hancock was discovered there, and Benny Hill was there, Fred Marx was discovered there. About 5 or 6 different comedians were actually discovered performing there. And I wanted to be discovered. And I wrote myself a 12-minute act, and I went on and I did it. And when it was finished, I went to the green room at the back, and Alan Crook, who was a producer, who was an agent, he's the one that discovered all those comedians. He came into the room. I said, "Alan," I said, "do you see my act?" He said, yeah. I said, "Well, what do you think of it?" He said, "Do you want me to be honest?" I knew I was in trouble right away, right? I said, "Yes, please." He said, "Well, I've seen some great comedians on the stage with lousy material, and you're the complete opposite." He said, "Do yourself a favour, never appear as a comedian again, but take up writing." And he introduced me to Dennis Dorden, who got me writing gags for Benny Hill, 2 weeks later. And that was how it all started.
That is fantastic. I mean, so you've written for some of the biggest names in comedy, and you've written for 3 of my great British comedy heroes, Les Dawson, Dick Emery, and my great hero, Kenneth Williams. How do you adapt to each style? How do you adapt writing material to each individual?
Well, you metamorphosize. You imagine you're that person.
Right.
And you create the situation, and you talk as if you were that person. You've got to be, you've got to know that their style, study their style, obviously. I mean, what you've written for Tommy Cooper would never fit Frankie Howard. You've got to know who they are, what they are, and what the audience perceive them to be.
Right.
I mean, the audience perceived Tommy Cooper to be an idiot. And it worked because Tommy Cooper was an idiot. I realized that. I realized that the day he said to me, Brad, he said, "You're Jewish." He said, "A friend of mine's son is getting bar mitzvah, and they've invited me along to the synagogue, and they expect me to say something funny. Can you give me something funny to say?" I said, "Well, when we Jews go to the synagogue, we wear a skull cap, which is called a couple, Kupel, couple. So he went along to the synagogue, and the man outside said, any man that comes in here has to have a couple. So when it had a couple, time I came back, it was all finished. He's got funny. He said, I didn't understand it. He hadn't got much up here, but he had the beautiful face of an innocent child. And when you see a baby, you've got to smile. And when you see Tommy Cooper's face, you had to smile.
It's true. It's true. What about a comedian then like Kenneth Williams, who was more famous for kind of his acid persona, you know, that kind of the quips and the tongues and the put downs?
Well, have you ever read his book, Acid Drops? He hated everybody.
He did.
I had him on one show. I did a radio series because I didn't know I only do comedy. I mean, I did 144 radio shows about law. I did 60 radio shows about confidence tricks. And I had him on the confidence trick shows. It was, I dramatized 3 different scams per show, and it had a panel of celebrities who I stopped the scam halfway through, or Shaw Taylor fronted it. He stopped the scam halfway through, and the panel had to guess how it went on from there. And on one of the shows, Kenneth Williams was the guest. And because it was radio, then you couldn't see the faces. So what I said was at the beginning, we'll establish their voices. Shaw Taylor will ask them, have you ever been involved in a scam? And they would then tell a story, and that till we establish their voices. And when it got to Ken, he did a story which was 4 minutes and 40 seconds. I said, Ken, I said, this is just to establish your voice. The most we want 20 seconds. The most is 40 seconds. He said, oh, I was only kidding. I don't want it. On the show, I'll do what you say. On the show, he did 6.5 minutes. He loved
Not
the
that
sound.
anybody would need any time at all to distinguish his voice.
Yeah, he loved the sound of his own voice. He really did.
And was this live?
No, we thank God we pre-recorded all those shows and we were able to snip it out afterwards. But
Were there any comedians whose voices that you could get inside of their heads easier than others, or were there some people that were particularly difficult to emulate?
Well, I mean, some people had the same sort of temper as I had. I mean, certainly Les Dawson, who I dearly loved. Les was a lovely, lovely man to work with. Never an argument on the series at all. He was never fluffy. And the only thing he wouldn't do, Les, is let me write his monologues. He let me write the sketches, but he had 37 monologues, which he'd built up over the years before he really became a star. And what he'd do in each of the show was take a gag from here, a gag from there, and make his monologues from there. But he wouldn't ever let me write new gags for him. And I think it's very much the same as Max Bygraves. I did a show. Max Bygraves was a guest on one of my Mike and Bernie Winter shows. And at rehearsal, he did a very funny act. And I watched it. And afterwards, I said, Max, I said, I've got a gag that would fit in there. He said, what is it? And I told it to him. He said, great, it's marvelous. I said, well, obviously you'll do it on tonight's show then. He said, oh, no. I said, why? He said, because it takes me 6 weeks to fly into a calm. I've got to do that gag for at least these 6 weeks in nightclubs before I have the guts to do it on part of my act.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
You can understand that?
You can. No, completely.
You can never be sure of an audience. I mean, I don't know whether you read William Goldman's book called The Season, in which he went on Broadway, covering every show. I think the night that Kennedy died, Kennedy was shot, and the audience weren't laughing. I mean, when Princess Di died, the audience weren't laughing. Aberfan Disaster, the audience weren't laughing. You can never be sure, no matter how good your material is, or you follow on. I did a talk once for Norweb. Norweb are the electricity boards, up north, and it was at the Elstree. It was one of the racecourses, in the club in the racecourse, and I was sitting next to the chairman. And the chairman said, ladies and gentlemen, how nice it is to meet all my employees once a year at this dinner and dance, meet your husbands, your wives, your boyfriends and girlfriends. I really enjoy it. unfortunately, it won't be quite the same next year, sorry. Won't be the same next year because I'm going to have to make 25% of you redundant. But let's forget about that now. Let me introduce you to a very funny man, Brad Ashton. I did 40 minutes. I got no reaction to all talk nonsense. So the only reaction I got, I used to do a gag about my wife, who was a yoga teacher, and say that for 20 years you've been trying to get me connected with yoga. The only thing she's got me on now is the mantra. The mantra is think of the same word over and over again for 20 minutes. And the word she got me thinking of is divorce. One guy turned around and said, "Ha, bloody ha." And that's the only reaction I got in the 40 minutes. So you can never be sure, no matter how funny material might be, that you're ever going to get your laugh.
Oh, that's fantastic.
How does it feel for you as a performer when you are giving it your all and you think this material usually works? How do you try to connect with the audience, or do you just try to get through it as best you can?
Well, that's the usual thing is you speed up like mad, get through it as quick as you can. But I was always taught, don't do the complete opposite. And so if it ever happens like that, I do slow down a lot and make ad-libs about how I'm dying, you know.
Who taught you that, to do that?
I don't know. I remember once seeing Leslie Randall. Leslie Randall was a great friend of mine. I had him on many shows. And when I first met him, he said, "Brad, I'd like you to write for me. You must come and see my act." And it was at the Chiswick Empire, going way back. He said, "I've got a 20-minute act." He said, "You can make notes for me." He said, "But I'd like you to see the way I perform and write material for me." I went along, and the moment he came on stage, he was barracked by a woman in the audience. And he never got through one word of his act. The whole 20 minutes was just him and the woman shouting at him back and forth. So you just play the audience, whatever audience you're given, you have to play according to them, you know.
I know, absolutely, absolutely. Of all the stars that you worked with, Brad, were they all quite willing to trust you as the writer, or did some of them like to have as much input?
Oh no, I mean, I did 6.5 years writing Alfred Marx type shows from 1956 to 1962. I did them together with Dick Vosborough. And many times, Dick and I would hand in the script, and the time we got to the rehearsal, it had changed.
Yeah.
And it was many, many, many years later that we learned that Alfred Marx had got it in the contract that his wife had to veto the script, and she was the one who had changed it.
Oh, wow.
Sometimes you don't know who's changed the stuff. I mean, I was working on a series called Our House, which we did 46 episodes of, and it was written by Norman Hughes. Does that name mean anything to you?
It does. The great Carry On writer, Norman Hughes.
Right, Norman wrote the first 8 carry-ons.
He did.
Right? And he also wrote the original script of this Our House series, which I then had to rewrite because we had the strike and we couldn't get all the people we wanted in it. And he used to come in to me and say, "Hey, Charles Hawtrey came out with a lovely gag yesterday." And he'd tell me the gags. I had written them. Peter Rogers came to Dick Vosborough and I and paid us £100 to read through the scripts and add any gags we could think of. But Norman believed that every comma he wrote was sacrosanct. He wouldn't change a thing deliberately. But if the comedian changed, it's different. But if he knew that another writer changed it, he would have sulked in the corner for days, you know. So that was.
So talking about the Carry On films, actually, what about the performers of the Carry Ons that didn't get the recognition that the others got? Obviously, everybody revered the likes of Sid James and Kenneth Williams, but we had, like you just mentioned, the great Charles Hawtrey and Bernard Bresslaw and Joan Sims, all these amazing performers who kind of maybe didn't get the full appreciation at the time. How was it like to
Well, I was reading last week, and Jack Douglas was in, and his agent phoned him up. He said, "Got good news for you. They want you to do the next Carry On." He said, "Marvelous. The only thing is they don't want to pay you." And so a lot of them just did it for the publicity alone.
Yeah.
What I thought was funny about the Carry Ons was that if you go to America, they thought that's the way we live. It's the same as in the 30s. We thought every American carried a gun because all these gangster films we saw. It was sort of our ambassador to America. But certainly Sid James, who a lovely man. And I had him on one show, the Michael Bernie Winter show. And it was a time when the Phil Silver shows were very popular. So I wrote a sketch in which Sid James played a London taxi driver. and doing sort of Bilko thing, going over bumps to make the meter go and everything.
Yeah.
And at rehearsal, it was fine. On the show, he didn't get one laugh. And he said to me after, Brad, he said, I love you, but I'll never work with you again. He was very cut up when Hancock dropped him. I mean, that was the biggest mistake Hancock ever made, dropping Sid James, Kenneth Williams, Hattie Jakes, and the other one, the Australian one, Bill Kerr.
Yeah.
Because comedy comes out of contrast. And once
Yeah,
you
it
lost
does.
them, you didn't have the contrast.
Why do you think he did that? I recently read about that actually in a book that I read about British double acts, and it said that, you know, there was a time when it seemed that Tony Hancock and Sid James, although not an official double act, they were a real good partnership. And then Tony Hancock wanted this control.
Tony Hancock always wanted to be a big Hollywood star.
Right.
And he felt that being teamed with someone else was holding him back.
Mm.
And that was the whole trouble. And of course, as you know, he was a big drinker. And it was because of his drinking that Kenneth Williams became a star. Because in the radio series, the original radio series, Hancock was off stage for 5 minutes in the middle of every show while he whipped round the corner and had a drink. And they had to fill in with Kenneth Williams. That's how Kenneth Williams became a star. But Kenneth Williams had a series, I think it was called the Sunday Club, down from the Hippodrome Theatre. And at the time, I was writing the series called Lenny and Jerry, with Lenny Bennett and Jerry Stevens. And I watched the show, and huge laughs were coming. I couldn't understand why. I figured, that's not funny. Why is he getting such big laughs? And so I asked for a ticket to see the show, and I went along and saw the show. And the first 12 rows were all his gay friends. And he was putting in all these gay phrases, which I didn't know, of course.
Right.
And that's how he's getting a lot of the big laughs.
So again, it comes back to that thing, doesn't it, of playing to your audience, of knowing your audience and feeding off them.
So talking about diversity, how was it for you? Because we know that you wrote not only for an English audience, but you went over to America and you were writing for many different countries. So how was that for you, adapting your humor to those different audiences?
Well, see, the thing is, today a comedy writer is a comedy writer, a drama writer is a drama writer. When I was around, there were only about 14 professional TV writers, and you had to write everything. So you wrote documentaries, you wrote films, you wrote plays, you write just about everything. You had to be adaptable. This is the thing. That's why I said I wrote 140 programs on law. I mean, show me another comedy writer that bothers with those kind of things. But you pick up a subject that fascinates you, study it, and that becomes your gimmick, as it were. But writing for these other countries, well, I don't speak any other language to start with. But they all the executives of all the countries, the 7 countries I worked for, all the executives spoke perfect English. And how did I get to them? Because I went to Montreux. Montreux used to be the Golden Rose Festival. That was my big investment every year. I would go for the 5 days to the festival and mix with all the producers. There were 32 countries represented there. And I'd mix with all the producers there and make friends with them. I found the best way with that was they showed their best shows. That was a big competition. And you go to the producer of the show and you say, that was fantastic. That was marvelous. I love that. I said, really? Yeah. I'll tell you how you can do it even better. And then you're selling yourself. Yeah. That's the whole point, you see. If I was writing, I would have also added, but you built them up, you get confidence, and you make friends with them. And that's how it started for Germany was I was writing for Dutch television. And then let's tell you how I started for Dutch television, again, was an accident, because I was working in my office in Old Court, which is the Associated London Scripts. We had 12 offices there. I had one then. And I suddenly got a knock on my door, and these 2 Dutch producers came in and said, look, we're supposed to have a meeting with Johnny Spate 2 hours ago. And we've been waiting for him. He hasn't turned up. Said because he was going to sell us all the Arthur Haynes scripts that he wrote for a comedian that we're building up called Johnny Crichton. I said, well, I don't know where he is, you know. They said, well, we can't hang around much longer because we've got to miss our plane back. Can you write for them? I said, well, to be honest, I said, everything I've written has been for a specific comedian. I can't write for, I don't know who this Johnny Crichton is. I can't write for him unless I actually see him working. They said, what are you doing on Saturday? I said, well, Saturday's my wedding anniversary. Right, fine. Celebrate it. We'll pay for your ticket. Bring your wife over and you meet Johnny Crichton.
Oh, wow.
And then, so I turned up at the airport with my wife in Schiphol Airport, and they dragged me away from my wife, pulled me along and put me into a room, sat me down at a table with a bottle of Coca-Cola on the table. And then they brought in this comedian, Johnny Crichton, and they flashed all the photographers and newspapers. So the headline for the day is Johnny Crichton gets a new writer and gives up booze for drink. That's how it all started. Then writing for Holland, as I did for about 15 years. One day I had to fly back from Schiphol to London, and it was a bad fog at Heathrow. And so they diverted us to Frankfurt. And we didn't know how long we'd been there, so they give you a voucher to go to the canteen and have a meal. And I happened to sit next to this German guy, and we got talking. He said, who are you? What do you do? I said, I'm a scriptwriter, a comedy writer. He said, oh, really? I said, yes, you know who I am? I said, no. He said, my name's Guy Walter. I'm the head of light entertainment of ZDF, which is the German equivalent of the BBC. He said, I was flying to London to find a writer. His fate has got us together. And
What are the odds?
I wrote loads and loads of shows for German television.
Oh, that's...
So did you adapt your comedy and they would then just translate it? Or
Yeah. At that time, they didn't really have the greatest sense of humor. Give you an example of what I mean. We did a lot of shows out of Munich. And there I was. I go off the train at Munich railway station. And in the forecourt of the station was a guy with a barrow. And on that barrow were snacks. There was sandwiches and sweets and all kinds of teas and coffees and all those kind of things. And he had a notice in the front there, all you can eat for 10 Deutschmarks, right? I thought, that's interesting. People paying the 10 Deutschmarks and helping themselves as much as they want. That's it. I was at that time writing for a comedian called Dieter Hallervorden, who I suppose would be the normal wisdom of German television. And so I had him now running this barrow. That was his sketch. Running the barrow, and people with no sense of all you can eat for 10 Deutschmarks. And a man comes along. He said, 10 Deutschmarks? Yes. Gave him 10 Deutschmarks. He said, so where are you going to? He said, I'm going to Cologne. He said, oh, you like Cologne. So it's a lovely town, lovely museum. You'll love it. Would you want tea or coffee? The guy said, I want coffee. All right, just go around the back and get it for you, sir. Goes around the back, picks up a loud hailer, says, the train for Cologne is leaving from platform 4 in 1 minute. All passengers, please make their way there. Another guy comes along. He pays his 10 Deutschmarks. He said, where are you going to, sir? So I'm going to Hanover. Oh, Hanover, it's like a village, but lovely, beautiful place. He says, I have tea. So just go around the back and get it for you, sir. The train for Hanover is leaving from platform 6 in 1 minute. All passengers, please make their way there. And he goes. A woman comes along, right? And she pays her 10 Deutschmarks. He said, where are you going to, madam? She said, I'm going to Dusseldorf. It's always an industrial town, but you'll like it very much indeed. You want tea or coffee? She said, I have tea. So just go around back and get it for you. Goes around the back, picks up the train for Dusseldorf is leaving from platform 6 in 1 minute. All passengers, please make their way there. And she's eating. The train for Dusseldorf is leaving in 40 seconds from platform 6. All passengers, please make their way there. The plane for Düsseldorf is leaving almost immediately. All passengers make their way there, or you'll miss the train. And she's still eating. He said, madam, I thought you were going to Düsseldorf. He said, yeah, that's tomorrow. I came in today to find out what time the trains were. Now, that was the rule of 3. That's the biggest comedy rule there is.
Yeah.
The Germans cut out the middle one because it was a short time. Didn't work. They hadn't got they didn't understand. It was only about 1971 they started buying the 2 Ronnies that they started to understand British comedy. And that was the time also when they took the Monty Python lot over there. You know the Monty Python shows in German. And only one of them actually spoke German. What's his name? Graham Chapman or George? He's the only one who spoke German. All the rest did it parrot fashion, which you can't do with comedy. You've got to have expression in timing, right? And it was a terrible flop.
And talking of speaking different languages as well, I read an interview with you where you said that not many people would have known that Les Dawson spoke many languages.
Yeah, I had lunch with him in a Chinese restaurant, and he spoke Chinese to the waiter for 20 minutes.
Wow.
Brilliant man, but such a lovely, unassuming man. He wrote the him and Bob Monkhouse wrote the foreword to my first book, How to Write Comedy.
Oh, amazing.
And our second book was The Funny Thing About Writing Comedy. Nobody wrote the foreword to that one. The third book was the Job of a Lifetime, in which one of my students, because I ran a comedy writing school for 6 years, one of my students, you can see who it was? Jimmy Cricket.
Oh, wow.
Forward to that one. And the final one is one, my latest book. You see it, Stand Up and Be Laughed At. And the forward to that was written by, can you see?
Oh, the great Ken Dodd.
And Ken and I were friends for about 30 years, only because I wouldn't work with him. The other book which was interesting was the Daleks book, which I wrote together with Terry Nation, who invented the Daleks.
Oh, fantastic.
And I've never, and to this day, I've never seen a Daleks book, never seen a Dalek show. When Terry said he's supposed to write it himself and he got ill, he said, I've written the first 33 pages. He said, but I'm too ill to write the rest. Would you write it? I said, but Terry, I've never seen a Dalek show. He said, good, then you won't pinch anybody's ideas. And it's become now, I saw it for £265 as a collector's item.
A real collector's item, yeah, wow.
Yeah. I got only £189 for writing it.
Now, just before we move on to our next question, Brad, we've got to ask you about working with the legendary Groucho Marx. I mean, that's next level in terms of, you know, working with the greats. That must have been so intimidating. How was it to write for or to work alongside somebody like Groucho?
Well, interesting. There you can see first, see what people didn't realise is that Groucho, though he's supposedly a great ad-libber, and he probably was, but he always had 3 writers. Right. And in the contract, as was in mine, you were not allowed to tell anybody that you were writing for him.
Right.
But the other 2 writers were Mike. Oh God, I forgot his name. He's now a big agent anyway. And the other one was the guy who wrote Rude Health. Another writer. He died about 6-7 years ago. There were the 3 of us. I was the head writer on it. Groucho was fine, but he was then 74 years old.
Right.
And his eyes were going. And he couldn't remember scripts. So what he had was 2 contestants sitting on high chairs, on high stools. And Groucho would be to their left. And they were facing the audience. And Groucho, while looking at them, was actually looking over their shoulder at the script, which was being rolled off on the wall behind them. But, you know, that was fine. But after about 6 shows, became trouble for me. Because part of my job was not only writing the script, and also finding the contestants. And one of the contestants I found was a guy who had been an insurance man in show business. He insured Semprini's fingers. He insured John Hanson's voice. He insured Lionel Blair's legs. And he also insured Sabrina. Now, I don't know whether you remember, Sabrina was the big busted lady of the day, the Dolly Parton of the day.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Not famous for that. She did all the Arthur Askey shows and all that. All the jokes were about her bust. And the terms of the insurance were that her bust measurement was 40 inches. If it went to 38 or less for 3 months or more, she would get £2,600 an inch.
Oh,
which
wow.
in 1965, when we did the show, was a lot of money. Right?
Yeah.
Now, when they actually signed the contract, her bust measurement had gone up to 41. Now, I said to Groucho, do you know who Sabrina is? He said, no, who is she? I said, never mind, forget it. And I stayed up all that night. I wrote a routine about that. And we were supposed to do the show 2 days later, and it wasn't in the script. So I said to the producer, what happened? He said, well, Groucho refused to do it. I said, why? He said, well, go ask him. I said, well, I haven't, Groucho. He said, well, it's all about tits. He said, I said, no, it's not. The humour of it is that we, the audience, know something that you don't know. He said, but I know now. I said, yeah, it's fine. But it was legitimate you didn't know. And I've written it along those lines. And I said, and I've stayed up all night doing it. I said, they told me you were going to be a pain in the neck, but you're now hurting all the way down. I said, I've had enough. I've had enough. I said, unless you do the routine, I'm not going to do the show anymore. He said, you mean you're quitting? I said, yeah. He said, but nobody quits, Groucho. He said, I fire people. I said, great, fire me, then they've got to pay me for the rest of the series. and we're now shouting at each other. And there's a crowd of about 30 people there. And he said, I'll tell you what, smartass. He said, I'll do the whole routine. But if one gag and it doesn't get a laugh, you're fired. What do you say to that? I said, fine, as long as it all gets laughs, I will double my salary from now on, which is like digging a knife thing. So anyway, I must say he was a brilliant performer, and he did it and got laughs all the way through. Everything in it got laughs. It was 1965. I could only remember a couple of lines of it. Now, he said, I also insured Sabrina. And I said, well, I don't know Sabrina. Is she a big figure in show business? I said, well, yeah, in some places. I said, what do you mean some places? You mean like Glasgow, Middlesbrough? He said, yeah, you're in the right direction, up north. And so it went on, right? And in the end, he said the bus measurement went up to 41. She had an inch in hand. And I had him finish by saying, well, it's the first thing that's gone up. They can't blame on Harold Wilson, who was the
Prime Minister, yeah.
Now, Groucho could not stand losing a bet, as it virtually were. So from there onwards, for 3 weeks, he used to phone me up at least 3 times a week about 3 o'clock in the morning when he came out of nightclubs and say, you know everything. I'm going tomorrow to Woolworths to buy some matches for my pipe. Should I buy my way or Mr. He stupid things like that, you know, just to get his home back. But if you go to my local bank here in Southgate in London, on the wall still is the first check he gave me, which the bank manager put into a glass case on the wall.
That's incredible. I mean, not only working with Groucho, Brad, but also having a row with him.
Oh yeah.
Then
many years later, about 5 years later, I was actually in Hollywood, and I, you know, if you go to Hollywood, you've got the maps of where all the film stars live.
Yeah.
So I went round to his house, and I knocked on the door, and he opened the door in his pajamas. He said, "Yeah." I said, "Me, Brad Ashton." He said, "Never heard of you," and slammed the door. Whether he was getting his own back or not, I don't know.
So, how was it for you writing for people that were such icons? Were you intimidated, or were you confident in what you were doing?
I'm very, very, very lucky in that nothing scares me. I could go into the Albert Hall and talk to 8,000 people. It wouldn't worry me. I have this sort of attitude that, all right, so what can they do? Shoot me if I'm a flop? Yeah.
Yeah.
If you've been a flop, this is the lesson I learned. The very first public speech I ever made, I was a terrible flop. It was in Blackpool. It was a huge do at the Hotel where everybody was there. Ken Dodd was there, Michael Burney was there. Every star you could think of was there. Big charity, annual charity do. And 6 of us had to make speeches. And George Martin, Dick Emery, Bernie Winters, and I was the last one. And I got up, and as soon as I opened my mouth, they barracked me. I never managed to finish one line without being barracked. So I just said, well, I thank you on behalf of all the scriptwriters, I thank you from my bottom and nowhere else. And I got up and I went back to my hotel, and I didn't come out of that room for 4 days. I was so embarrassed that I was flopped. But then you realize, so what? So you flop. Who remembers it? Who cares? You go back again, you know.
So we've mentioned lots of performers there, Brad, and we've talked about some of our favourite variety performers. Now, what about you? Who are your favourite variety entertainers?
Certainly, well, certainly I thought Max Miller was great to watch. Great man. I do talk about him a lot, why he got banned from the BBC and ITV, but he was a great guy because he couldn't have cared less. He had so much money in the end, he couldn't have cared less. But he did foster people like Alfred Marx and other comedians. Certainly Bob Monkhouse. I have the greatest respect in the world for Bob, because Bob was the nicest guy. 3 hours every day you couldn't talk to Bob, because Bob was in his hut, in his shed, in his garden, looking at tapes of American comedians trying to learn, all the time more and more trying to learn. Remember, he had 4 writers under contract. I was one of them. He paid us 8,000 quid a year, and we just sent him any gags we could think of. And then he edited them brilliantly. But he was so generous. What did surprise me was I used to do the cruises. I did 62 cruises as a lecturer on cruises. And he said to me one day, he said, Brad, I see you going on Queen Elizabeth and you're stopping off at Barbados. I said, yeah. He said, well, my wife Jackie and I have just had this beautiful house built on the beach in Barbados, and we'd love to show it to you. when you get off the boat, come and have lunch with us. Fine, great. We went to his house, and it was a really beautiful house. He said, as I knew you were coming, Brad, look what I've got. I've got to open this bottle of vintage, was it brandy or something? Vintage malt brandy. I said, Bob, I don't drink. He said, oh, come on, you'll have one. I said, I don't drink. He says, my wife, oh, Valerie, you'll have one, surely. She said, I don't drink either. And Bob said, this is terrible. I said, what's so terrible? He said, I feel because you don't drink and I drink, that you're censuring me for drinking, but I have to drink. I said, what do you mean you have to drink? He said, well, I get £10,000 a night for performing. He said, I know I'm not worth it. I would love to work for half that amount, but my agent gets 10% and won't let me. He says, but unless I have at least 2 whiskies, I can't go on and face an audience. And then I have to have 2 to quieten down afterwards. And I can understand that because Leslie Crowther, who I, again, loved working with, I did 2 series of Cracker Jack. Lovely, lovely man, but an alcoholic. Smashed up his Rolls Royce and died after that. The greatest comedian for me, the last is, who's 93 now, I think, Dick Van Dyke.
Oh, of course.
An alcoholic, wrote 2 books about recovering alcoholics. Sid Caesar, who did 11 years on American television every Saturday night for an hour and a half, wrote a book called Where Have I Been?, in which he says for 21 years he was on drinks and drugs and didn't know where the hell he was. And he had Carl Reiner bringing him back to the script each time he ad-lib around him. So it's a hell of a lot of drinking in show business. And I can understand that because they have to rely on people like me to keep them funny. And it's frightening, you never know.
And how is it for you as the writer watching other people do your jokes? How do you feel in the audience when that's happening?
I'm so proud that they've do a joke. So, people always say to me, aren't you worried people are going to steal your material? There was one joke I wrote for Jimmy Tarver when I was writing all the stuff for the Palladium for years. And they all do it now. And Jimmy comes out and says to the audience, where are you all from? And they all shout out names of towns they're from. And he picked one guy and said, you're from Liverpool? Really? What part of Liverpool? Guy said, from River's Edge. River's Edge? No, really? What street? The guy said, Moorhouse Street. Now, there is a coincidence. My brother's working there tonight. He's a burglar. And I get very proud when I see comedians using it, because I think that I originated. So, yeah, I'm proud when people use my material. So you say, how is it for a writer? Well, it's terrible when you hear gag messed up.
Yeah.
Or even worse, when comedians, and I can think of at least 3 or 4 that do this, put in old jokes in the script for insurance. They know they're doing it in a nightclub. And for me, it kills because people remember say, "Oh God, they used that old joke." When what's Brad writing is like the old jokes for. So sometimes you have to fight with your comedians and say, "No, it's a very funny joke, but please don't do it."
And you don't mind that the comedian will get the credit for that joke, whereas it's your legacy.
That's my job is. My job is to make that comedian. People think that comedian is funny.
Yeah.
Way back in 1953. The biggest comedian in the country was Arthur Askey, right? 5'1", but the biggest comedian in the country. Because he had a TV series called Before Your Very Eyes, which everybody watched. And one day he wanted to do radio. And I got a call from Con Mahoney, who was the head of light entertainment at BBC Radio. He said, Brad, Arthur wants to do a radio series. We'd like you to write the pilot. Now, to me, I'd only been in the business a year. This was a huge accolade. I said, sure, great. And I spent 10 days working on that script, honing it, till I was happy with it. And after 10 days, I handed it in to Con Mahoney, never heard a word for a whole month. And the phone call said, Con, what happened? He said, I don't know. He said, I sent it to Arthur. 10 minutes later, he phoned me up. He said, Arthur Askey said, would you have lunch with him tomorrow? So there we were, Arthur and I, sitting down having lunch. We're talking about the weather. We're talking about politics. We're talking about traffic. No mention of the script at all. After half an hour, I couldn't stand this any longer. I said, Arthur, have you read the script? He said, yes, dear boy. I said, well, what did you think of it? He said, it's all right as far as it goes. I said, what do you mean as far as it goes? he said, well, you haven't put my ad-libs in yet. Now, until that point, I actually thought comedians ad-libbed. Didn't realise it was our job to make it look like they're ad-libbing. I mean, Morecambe and Wise is a prime example. Most of those so-called ad-libs are written in the script and have to be, because the camera's got to be on the person reacting, the person speaking. So Eddie Braben, who's writing them, wrote those lines to make it look like they're ad-lib. So that's the main job that a writer's got to be. You've got to pretend you're that person and say what you thought they would say in those situations. Yeah.
So you've touched on some rules of comedy, and you also said that you used to teach how to do comedy and comedy writing.
Yeah.
You said about writing in the ad-libs and the rule of three. Are there any other gold standard comedy rules that we should know about that you
I think the idea, the best thing is to break the comedy rules. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. John Cleese. John Cleese, incidentally, when one year when the Variety Club of Great Britain decided they wanted to give the award to John Cleese as the best comedy performer of the year. And he refused to go along to the studio to accept it. He said, I'll accept it, making my speech, sitting at my desk at my flat back at home. And he did. And right in front of him, on the front of the desk, was my first book, How to Write Comedy. So I feel like I possibly had some sort of input into his comedy. But any comedy writer will tell you, if you're writing a situation comedy, your main character has got to be someone's likable, someone you have empathy and sympathy with. And who did he invent?
Basil Fawlty.
Out and out swine, nasty to everybody. But it was a big success.
Yeah.
So, and also writing for people. I mean, do you know who Elf Garnet was written for?
Oh, I don't know.
Elf Garnet was written for Peter Sellers.
Was it?
And Peter Sellers was signed to do it.
I never knew that.
And then Peter Sellers, then someone dropped out of the film The Lady Killers.
Yeah.
And they asked Peter Sellers if he'd like to do the part. And he said, yeah, fine. But he was due to do a pilot of the Till Death Us Do Part, right? But the dates clashed. He couldn't do the film and that.
Wow.
And so he phoned the BBC and said, would you release me for the contract? Now, prior to that, the script has been seen by Leo McKern. And Leo McKern looked and said, this is me. This Elf Garnet character is me. Every line in it I could do blindfolded. Why didn't they offer it to me? So he phoned the BBC and said, can I have the part of Elf Garnet? They said, sorry, we've already signed Peter Sellers. So when Peter Sellers had decided whether he wanted to do the film or the pilot, he decided if I do the film, it might lead to bigger parts, which we now know it did. If I do the pilot, in those days, and I think it's probably still the same today, for every 8 pilots they do, only one becomes a series. Yeah. I might be wasting my time. So he asked the BBC to release him from the contract. They thought, well, Leo McKern's ready to do it. They released him, went to Leo McKern, and they said, too late, you should have asked me yesterday. I've just signed to do Paul of the Bailey. And they finally found Warren Mitchell to play the part.
I was going to say, I bet Warren Mitchell was grateful.
Warren was very grateful, but Warren saved the series because Johnny Spate was a drinker, and Johnny used to remember. Johnny lived in Northwood, in North London, and he turned his attic into an office. And he remembers going up to his office with a bottle of whiskey, and many times coming down with the bottle empty and the script written, but only about 25 minutes. And Warren was able to ad-lib the other 5 minutes in character. So, but do you know that Warren Mitchell started out as a song and dance man?
I didn't know that either. No, I didn't.
Stage school in Walthamstow and learned ballet and singing.
Oh, incredible!
Yeah.
So I can't leave this question in particular about great comedy performers without commenting on Danny Kaye, who we spoke about in previous emails, because for me, those videos, you can access them on YouTube, of him at the London Palladium. I can only dream of having the audience in the palm of your hand as he did in those days.
Apparently he was very nervous. He says he's very nervous. I was 16, I think it was, when he came over in about 1946, where it was. And I'd already seen the show. I went to the first night of the show. And the last night of the show, he's going to do a special show. And I got up at 6 o'clock that morning, got to the Palladium at 6:30, and there were 2,000 people in the queue for tickets.
Wow.
And the commissioner came up and down saying, look, there are only 300 tickets left. And none of us would leave that thing for about 2 hours hoping we'd get tickets to see the show. He had that much pull. Great, great, great performance.
So talking about theatres, Brad, what would you say is your favourite theatre of all the theatres you've visited over your
well, certainly the Hackney
career?
Empire. Hackney Empire was that's where I met so many comedians. And see, I also devised at that time. I wanted to be a writer, so I would go along to cover them for the Hackney Gazette as well, and at the same time drop the fact that I was a writer and do a few ad lib gags, and that got me a lot of work for them. But that was Hackney Empire, and certainly the Palladium. I mean, the Palladium. I went along to because I did for 3.5 years. I did all Tommy Trinzer stuff. Again, like Tommy Trinzer, like Groucho Marx, wouldn't let me mention that I was writing for him. If ever anybody came into the dressing room when I was there, he'd say, "Look, I've told you, Mr. Ashton, this sleeves are too short. I don't be the tailor." Never ever admit that he had a writer, but a lovely man, Tommy. Except for the fact he was paying me 15 guineas a week in those days. I'm going way, way, way back. And I asked him for a rise to 20 guineas, and I had to hold the phone off about 20 while he swore at me like that. I didn't get 20 guineas, I got 20 quid. I was in his dress. I had an office in those days in Bond Street. I rented an office in Bond Street, and that was at number 40. And Tommy Trinzer had an office at number 24. And we often had lunch together. And I was in his office one day, and the phone rang. And he had a phonodeck, where you can put the phone down, you can hear the conversation going all around the room. Right? And the voice the other end said, Mr. Trinzer, I can't remember what the guy's name was. I'm the chairman of BOAC, which was before British Airways, British Overseas Airways Corporation. I'm the chairman of BOAC, and on Sunday we're having our annual do, and we'd like you to be our guest of honour. And I said, well, that's very nice of you. Thank you very much. Would you like me to say a few words? He said, well, if you would, that'd be very nice. And Tommy said, that would cost you 2,000 quid. And I said, well, look, we're not asking you to do an act. I mean, we are giving you a lunch. And Tommy said, I've got a fridge full of food back home. And he got the 2,000 quid. That was Tommy. Again, a lovely man to work with.
I'd love to know, Brad, were you funny as a child?
No.
What got you into comedy?
I'm not. You say I'm not funny. In fact, my wife never laughed at anything I say. And those 5 books I showed you, she never read them. And worse still, I sent my last book, that had me laughed at, to my son who lives in Yorkshire. And last week he phoned me up. He said, Brad, his dad. He said, I've finally got round to reading your book. I'm in the loo. He said, page 1 is in front of me. In a minute, it'll be behind me. You can't win at all. But every time, if I said something funny at home, he'd turn around and say, Dad, save it for the office. No appreciation at home whatsoever.
Well, we've got one more round of questions, a little quick fire round now, where we're going to give you some options, and we'd just like you to answer with the first thing that that comes to your head. So, would you want to start, Maria?
I will. So, would you prefer to write for Kenneth Williams or Tommy Cooper?
Tommy Cooper, certainly, yeah.
Do you prefer the Marx Brothers or the Three Stooges?
Certainly the Marx Brothers, yeah. Marx Brothers. One's visual, one's verbal, yeah.
Would you prefer to be sat in the stalls or sat in the gallery?
In the stalls, yeah, in the stalls.
Do you prefer dinner before a show or after a show?
Interesting. Before the show, I always have, yeah.
And would you prefer to write for a UK audience or an American audience?
Different style, interesting. Certainly an American audience, because you can be more truthful than the American audience. They believe more in being truthful. I did an American series called The Ugliest Girl in Town. I was story editor on it, and they threw out a lot of gags. They said, look, too funny. We want to be more realism, more pathos, and forget being all funny all the way through.
Why do you think that is?
Well, because they want to have truth in comedy. They don't have comedy vicars and that kind of thing. They like it based on truth if possible. And that's one of those things I learned from America. The main lesson I learned from American television was from the abuse of Jerry Davis in that series I just talked about, where he said, you're wasting a lot of time trying to write a script from beginning to end. He said, because halfway through you change your mind, you go off different channels. He said, start off with writing it as a short story, 3 pages, 1,000 words. Then you've got a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what you then do is flesh it out into scenes, then flesh the scenes out into dialogue. And it saved me a hell of a lot of trouble learning to do it that way, rather than trying to because you've got about, most writers have got about 40 scripts they've never finished, because halfway through you've gone off on tangents and it didn't work.
Who would you say, Brad, had the most different offstage persona from their onstage persona? Who was the most...
Frankie Howard, certainly.
Wow,
Howard, certainly. He was the most morose guy off stage. Entirely. He was going to sue me once for saying that he was gay.
Wow, of course, yeah. He famously kind of did.
Well, because in those days it was illegal.
Yeah.
What happened was I was working on the Saturday morning. Just Johnny Spate and I were in the office, and Eddie, his whatever Eddie was, phoned me up and said, "Is Frankie arrived yet? He's coming to see Johnny Spate." I said, "No, not yet." He said, "Well, he's on his way." I put the phone down, and Johnny Spate said, "Well, who was that?" I said, "It was Frankie's boyfriend on the phone." At that moment, Frankie walked in. "He's not my boyfriend. He's my secretary. I'm going to sue you for saying I'm my boyfriend." And he brought him in. He said, "That's the one. He's the one we're going to sue."
Oh my God.
Lucky he didn't sue me. About a year later, he turned up in my office, and I'd been out to lunch with him. He turned up at my office, and he's sitting at my desk. I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I want you to read these." He threw 4 half-hour radio scripts on my desk. I said, "Why?" He said, "I'm going to lunch. I'll explain when I get back." I read the script. He came in. He said, "Well, you read them?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "What's the show called?" I said, "Well, it says on here, The Frankie Howard Show." He said, "Who gets the laughs?" I said, "Well, you get 65% of the laughs. The other 35 go to Robinson Hare, Wallace Eaton, and June Whitfield." He said, "What's the show called?" I said, "Well, it's The Frankie Howard Show." He said, "Exactly. It's my show. I want all the laughs. I want you to rewrite those scripts so I get every laugh. They're there to feed me. I'm not there to feed them." And that was Frankie Howard. He insisted on every show that he had to be chasing girls, so that he would hide the fact that he was gay. But he paid me, so I wouldn't complain. But that was Frankie.
I've got one more question. I'm so sorry, Brad, to keep you, but I could talk to you all night. Really, this is so fascinating. I'm loving it. Who is somebody that you've worked with that people would be surprised to learn that you've worked with? You know, obviously you're highly associated with comedy, but is there anyone else that people would be really surprised to learn that you worked with?
I'm trying to think who I worked with so many. What happened with Huey Green? I had him as a guest on an Alfred Molstein show, and we shared a taxi after the rehearsal. And I was cracking jokes, obviously, in the taxi. The following day, he phoned up the office. He said, I'm doing this series, W Money. He said, I want someone to write the gags for me on the sheets of paper. And I wrote all his gags for the W Money for about 2 or 3 years.
Fantastic.
But, you know, he cleverly, he and Bob Monkhouse had the same gimmick. They hold a card. On that card would be the names of the contestants, right? But actually, also in that card were all the gags I'd written.
Yeah.
So when they wanted to ad-lib a gag, they'd do that with the card, right? The camera would come off of them onto the contestant. They then look down at the card, pick what gag they wanted, straighten up again, camera on them, and ad-lib the gag.
Wow.
So Bob and well, I suppose others besides Hughie, that's the way they used to do it, to make it look like they were ad-libbing the gag.
All these backstage secrets.
This is what we want. My final question would be, your comedy talent aside, if you could just suddenly have any other God-given show business talent, what would it be?
It's very, very simple to answer. And I can only tell it by telling one very quick story, explain it. I went to Jack Benny came over to England to do a show for Thames Television, and there was a strike on, and so they cancelled the show, and instead they took over the Albert Hall, 6,000 people there, and Jack Benny and the London Philharmonic Orchestra was going to do the show. And Jack Benny came on and did the show, and he played the piano, the violin very badly. And 5,999 people were laughing their heads off. And not me. I'm tone deaf and beat deaf. I would love to be able to appreciate music, but that is the one thing that I miss terribly. So I used to write lyrics and they never scanned.
Right.
So that's the one that I would love to be able to write, to have a musical ear.
Brad, we won't take up much more of your time, but we just want to say thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. It's been a genuine honor, like it really has. And this has been magical for us. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Brad, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
I've enjoyed it.
Well, we hope that you really enjoyed that interview. Just the anecdotes are unreal.
And it's bizarre, isn't it? When you're speaking to someone that knew these people and that spoke to these people and that worked with these people, and the fact that he's this link between us and them kind of thing.
Well, yeah,
it's surreal, isn't it? It's really surreal.
And I don't think that he's even just that he knew them. I think like they were colleagues. Like they're not stars to him. They were just people he was working with.
Well, quite the opposite. When they were really at his mercy because they were relying on him to come up trumps with the material.
They were. And they did very well, if you ask me.
They certainly did. Well, we hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, rate, and review us on all your podcast providers, and give us a follow on social media, Frame This Presents, or on Twitter at Frame This Presents SOLP.
All that's left for us to say is...
See you next week! Did my voice break on Monkey?